being here and those online too. It's nice to have a number of.
Recording in progress.
So it's 11:13 and Mr. Smith, it's your turn to, you have 40 minutes. And as we did with Mr. Beacon, we will pepper you with questions and give you extra time.
Okay, thank you very much. I am, again, for the record, Nathan Smith. I'm here with my partner, Brian Kistler, here on behalf of Pend Oreille County. In the audience, we have Andy Huddleston and Vicki Kohler from Pend Oreille County Community Development Department. And then on the Zoom, we have Dolly Hunt, who is the county prosecuting attorney, and then also Greg Snow, who was, as described, the responsible official, and he is the director of the Community Development Department as well. So I think the theme that strikes me the most is, as we kind of unpack what the county has done, is that this is a matter of perspective. Is what the county is seeking to accomplish through its update to the comprehensive plan and the development regulations is to reflect the conditions in the county and then anticipate as best it can what the future might hold. And as the county has discussed extensively in its briefing, there is not a lot of prospective growth that the county anticipates is going to occur as a result of this update to the comprehensive plan. It looked to the Office of Financial Management and Projections to consider what it thought was best for its rural development, rural growth, and rural implementation. It then also considered those same concepts as it undertook its SEPA analysis, not once, but twice in this context, to consider the environmental consequences. Admittedly, the county didn't get it right the first time it went through its environmental review. The hearing examiner said, look, I don't think you thought enough about what the anticipated uses were going to be for the properties subject to the comprehensive plan designation. And I don't think you considered what those anticipated uses are. And I don't think you even considered what the probable likelihood is that they would occur. And in response, the county took a step back, said, we'll go back, we'll revise our SEPA checklist, we'll consider those growth patterns, that growth trajectory, and that growth and development. And then, in addition, we'll point to the specific sections of the county's development regulations that are going to mitigate and or aid in that in addressing those impacts, if there are any. So the SEPA analysis was a thoughtful and well-reasoned decision. The second time around, it was affirmed by the hearing examiner, who weighed and balanced very much the same evidence that is before the board today, in addition to the considerations that were addressed as part of the first hearing examiner decision. I think it's important to first kind of start maybe with the GMA side of the issues associated with the county's comprehensive plan, and then we can talk a little bit about the SEPA, because I think they're really two different issues that are addressed. So the first thing, and the board has already highlighted it, which is the deferential standard that's owed to the county as a result of its adoption, and that really requires a consideration of the entire record that's before the board, and it has to be considered clearly erroneous. And I think, in addition, it also presumes that the actions of the county are valid. And what that really reflects is the recognition that the local legislative authority, that is the Board of County Commissioners in this case, is in the best authority to make the determinations as to the comp plan and the development regulations across the board. So the first issue that is highlighted by the petitions in this case is really the notion of the rural element in the county's comprehensive plan. So there's two components that really are highlighted. The first is, does the county define what the rural element really is? And that's required under 3670A 0702B. And then the second piece is the requirement to then develop a written record that highlights what that harmonization really looks like as between the rural elements and the written record that exists. I don't think there's any question that the county's done both of these. The first thing is the county has engaged in a extensive process to deliberate and consider what the rural environment best is going to look like for the county. And that process has taken years in order for them to come up with a process. So the first piece of that really is just the engagement the county undertook as it considered what could and should go into its comprehensive plan through the decision-making process. And it's important, I think, to note this board and the courts have recognized this does not need to be a discrete document. It doesn't need to be embodied into a specific finding or conclusion in the Board of County Commissioners finding. It can be the sum total of the parts that have been assembled by the county. So first, I think the key thing is Section 2.3 of the county's comprehensive plan really is the county's, quote, rural element. And it defines the land use and the specific policies that the county wanted to consider as part of its rural element consideration. Before driving into what the rural element is, I think the consideration by the Planning Commission really highlights how the county went about doing this.
Well, I want to dig in because I want you to focus when you talk about the Planning Commission about what the county did.
Yep.
The assertion is that there's really no specified rural goals or policies
right.
Expressed in the comp plan or in the record. And so I want you to drill in on that a little bit because if that's the case, your petitioners have a point.
Right.
Show me how they're wrong.
Sure. So the petitioners on the front end first, I think the key is to say, procedurally, they went through a series of years of deliberative process, right? In order to develop goals and policies in order to establish what the criteria is going to be. And I think it's important to understand the core concepts of the county's comprehensive plan, particularly under, say, Section 1.3 of the plan says, it says the county is trying to, quote, strike a balance between proactively managing growth to sustain a healthy rural environment and protecting individual property rights. It's in the very first and beginning sections of the county's comprehensive plan that it wants to acknowledge the existence and protect the rural environment. It then goes on to identify a series of goals that it wants to incorporate in its comprehensive plan to protect that rural environment as well. So Section 2.3 of the comprehensive plan establishes a series of goals for the entire county that are designed to protect the rural environment. So the county says we're going to support new growth and development that is consistent with the demands of the county residents and that support future growth and economic vitality while maintaining the, quote, rural character of Oreille County. The county also, in turn, wanted to maintain the rural character of Oreille County, including forest lands, agricultural lands, mining, and natural resource land-based industries.
Your question about that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but this is how we pepper everybody. So you're not going to get special treatment. Here's the deal. Normally in county, what you've been seeing, and I don't feel one way or the other about this, but normally you see public lands being increased. Sure. Here you see them decreased. Sure. How did that really affect your forest lands, ag lands, and mining, your natural resource lands?
Sure.
How are they affected by this?
Well, the county actually has a net increase in the natural resource lands based upon the Anchor QEA report that was prepared. So one of the things that was kind of specifically discussed was the proposed Stimson land swap that would expand private land holdings within Oreille County as opposed to the lands held by the federal government. First, that actually seems to result in a net increase in natural resource lands that are available as a result of the swap. Second, I think it's difficult and nothing in the GMA seems to require the county to consider a proposed land swap.
Because when you say natural resource land, I want to make sure we're talking about lands of long-term commercial significance.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
yes.
On that point, okay, you stressed in your brief that the county increased natural resources lands by approximately 1,000 acres.
Right.
I mean, the petitioner's argument isn't that there was a decrease, it was that the county is not, conserving, the term in the GMA, conserving natural resources lands. And merely saying that you've increased the overall acreage of natural resources lands doesn't counter that argument if the regulations you have in place doesn't conserve. I mean, conserve isn't just a total number of acreage in the county. It's, what is now done with that acreage in order to preserve its character as natural resources land. So if you went from 10,000 acres to 11,000 acres, but your development regulations didn't conserve those lands, allowed incompatible development, petitioner would argue that they're violating 060.
Sure. And the county's position on that is, first, I think it's important to understand what was there before. So the county removed what was called a public lands designation and zoning criteria. So that zoning criteria basically said that the land is owned by a public landowner and therefore it should be zoned X. In this case, the county said that doesn't seem to match up with what the county's future interests are in terms of protecting those natural resource lands. Creates a difficult process for the county when it comes to updating land use regulations and code. And so then it said, well, instead we'll consider those lands under the natural resource protections of the county under 060. The county now says, and we'll follow the criteria under the GMA to say, well, we can allow accessory uses. So residential would be permitted, or those uses that would be directly potentially available to support the existing criteria or land uses that are permitted.
Were there no residential uses allowed when it was public land?
That's correct. There were not residential uses allowed.
How many potential new building sites have been created through that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a very interesting mathematical question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that specifically.
Okay.
But admittedly, the county does change that and provide for potential residential uses. That being said, much of that land is still under public land ownership. So it doesn't change the outcome here is not necessarily that residential development will occur as a result of the change. It just in natural resource lands, it would be permitted.
And under the Growth Management Act, that's allowed. Residents are not prohibited in natural resource lands.
Right.
They're limited due to the acreage size, minimum lot size. So how are the minimum lot sizes affected on those properties?
Well, in this case, it's got to be natural resource 20 or natural resource 40 in order to be permitted for residential purposes. They can't exceed the density that's otherwise permitted under the county development regulations. So the restrictions are you've got to have one house per 20 acres or one house per 40 acres under each of the natural resource designations. So there's no enhanced density that would otherwise be available because the property is in a natural resource land.
Okay.
So
I think we took about 6 minutes there. Was there more? Did you look at the clock?
I did not.
Yeah, I
think
it was about 6 minutes. I'm going to add 6.
Oh, feel free.
Okay.
I think, and the county wants to emphasize the process that it followed in terms of developing a comment matrix associated with this process. So the county reviewed and considered written comments that it received and responded to and addressed those comments through the comment matrix. And so that matrix highlights where the county used and considered the information that it collected through the public process and then responded to, highlighted changes to, as have been discussed, and or showed where the work was done elsewhere within the comprehensive plan. So in those cases, the county was able to say, we'll make a correction here, which they did, or here's a spot within the development regulations that would otherwise be a spot to look at. An example might be the comment number 69 that was relied to on a number of different points. I'll also draw the board's attention to Bates number POC 001401, which shows where the county made changes to the development regulations in order to respond to specific comments that were received. The
We're
petition.
gonna address that later, so you better put a mark in there though. Thank you.
Okay. And I also, the petitioners rely upon the Suquamish Tribe versus Kitsap County case to kind of highlight how the county seemed to not develop a written record showing how its rural elements comply with the GMA. In that case, there's actually just a single sentence reference to the county's rural goals and policies in a DEIS. And for what Kitsap County has, a rural wooded incentive program. That's not the same engagement that the county put together here. It's more than a sentence that the county interpreted here. And more than a sentence that shows how the county looked at the rural environment, developed its comment matrix, its meeting minutes, and then ultimately its development regulations and comprehensive plan. We've highlighted in our brief the goals and the policies the county developed in response to its review of its rural environment and how it wanted folks. I don't want to necessarily read verbatim back through the goals and policies that the county has in place. But the county fundamentally interpreted what it perceived to be its rural environment and developed goals and policies in response to that. And then provided for an opportunity to develop regulations to implement those. The other area that the county did do that is a revision to its development regulations is the PUD requirements.
Before you start there,
Yeah.
I just, forgive me for doing this to you.
Never.
But, talk about the water.
Sure.
Okay, I want to get that handled right now. How did the water case that we had, what was the name of that case?
The Hirsch case?
Hirsch case, how did the Hirsch case affect this county? Thank you.
Well, the county currently has 3 WIRAs. And the key WIRA that the county is most affected by is WIRA 55. And that's the WIRA that it shares with its neighbors in Spokane County and Stevens County. So the first thing I think that's important is that the Department of Ecology did not comment or object to the water resources component that the county developed. So the agency with expertise did not say to the county, what you're doing here is incorrect. So the second thing is that the county acknowledges under its environmentally sensitive area policy number 7, that it will in the future, when they're prepared, incorporate the WIRA 55 watershed plans into the county development codes and permit review procedures. As of the time of adoption, those weren't done yet. So the county's still working through a process with its neighbors to get those plans and policies in place.
What's happening right now? So what protections do these newly zoned and designated properties have as far as water goes currently then?
Sure. So the county does require that the individual property owners provide certificates of water availability when appropriate. So they've got to show that a well log and there is a well that shows that it will provide water to the intended use, if in fact that is going to occur.
Surface groundwater impact, is there any requirement for that to be documented?
The county is not required to be, and it's not in a position to measure impacts to groundwater as between individual users of the groundwater. It can only state that we don't want to impair the groundwater supplies of other property owners down the line. So the county cannot adjudicate the rights and responsibilities of individual property owners. It can only
So in other counties, they, like, for instance, the one I'm very familiar with, there's a red zone, yellow zone, green zone. And that deals with, surface water to groundwater connectivity. You have nothing in place in the county that deals with that. And my next question in connection with that is, this WIRA 55, are they dealing with that?
The WIRA 55 board is dealing with that, that's correct. So I'll answer the second question first.
Okay.
As to the first question, in WIRA 55, property owners are required to get their well log and provide for mitigation through the Department of Ecology. So that's independent from the county itself.
So you can't just willy-nilly do a exempt well and not have it reviewed by ecology?
That's correct. That's in the world of post-Hearst.
Yeah, let me tell you. Okay. I may have questions on that later.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay. So I think if I can take a step back and chat about the PUD regulations for a minute. I think we've explored the fact that innovative zoning techniques are permitted under the Growth Management Act. And the PUD requirements are the county's efforts to allow for innovative techniques. As I heard during the course of oral argument by the petitioners, there's some disagreement about what could be considered visual compatibility. That's a matter of subjective intent that doesn't otherwise exist. But the fact of the matter is the county has a process at a permit-specific level to address visual compatibility in the PUD process. So 50% opacity, that is one man's perspective on what might not be opaque or what might not result in compatibility on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is also maybe sufficient for other property owners. The county's process in reviewing and planning for PUDs, which goes through the hearing examiner, will address those compatibility issues at a project-specific level with the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan being the guiding document for those decisions.
Are there specific development regulations? I mean, generally speaking, comprehensive plans are more general documents, give guidance.
Yep.
But when the applicant comes in for their project level approval, what regulations are they going to be bound by to ensure rural compatibility?
Sure. So that's going to be within the county's PUD regulations, which does have that, and I'll call it, because a PUD is a discretionary mechanism, right? Under the county's development regulations, right? They're automatically entitled to the benefits of the PUD. One of those would be determining and confirming visual compatibility as between the innovative technique.
Right. So what standards does the planning staff use to apply to determine whether they met that?
So for instance, the 50% opacity buffer is contained in the county's plan use development regulations.
Well, we heard about that.
Yeah. No, there are not others in terms other than minimum lot sizes and maximum lot sizes that would otherwise be provided for here. Of course, the hearing examiner retains some discretion in terms of reviewing and approving those PUDs to determine whether that project might ultimately comply with and or meet those.
But in the absence of defined standards, it could be, subject to an allegation of arbitrary and capricious application.
Right.
I mean, so if you've got lot sizes, that almost goes without saying.
Right.
50% opacity, I'm sorry. That's, and that's it.
Right, but that's it, yeah. But the other side of it though, too, is that public process also provides for the hearing examiner to receive input from the public as to what might make those criteria.
Yeah.
Of course, the hearing examiner can't decide on public sentiment alone, right?
Right.
So there's got to be some measure of criteria.
And every hearing examiner here not been in, he will resort to the development regulations and determine yes or no, approve or do not approve, based upon whether the application complies with the development standards.
That's correct.
So 50% opacity standard works really good in treated areas.
Absolutely.
It works no good in the planning. So again, these are the kind of standards that drive me crazy, because how do you objectively look at them given the specifics of the property?
Sure.
So how is that dealt with when you have a property, let's just say has been generally used as open pasture or rangeland? Do you have rangelands here?
Well, there are open fields and ranges that exist.
Yeah,
it's difficult to have opacity that can kind of meet those criteria.
Yeah. So but there is the standard that they're supposed to take a look at, and These are challengeable too. The PUD are discretionary and they're challengeable. And they don't, I'm asking these questions all in the series, and they don't increase density in the overall lot itself. So if you have a 25 acre or 27 acre lot, you can only have 5 lots if you have 5 acres only. I don't know what your minimum lot size is in rural areas. What is your minimum lot size, just out of curiosity?
It's a 5 acre.
Okay, I think thank you, Cadiz County again for setting that standard.
Right.
So,
I think that's this board's responsibility on that.
Yeah, we nailed that down a long time ago. So, the 5 acre lots, you couldn't have more than 5 lots. You could, I don't know what your minimum lot is. Is it 1 acre minimum in the PUD?
Yes, that's correct.
So 1 acre minimums, you could have 4 lots and something like that, and then the parent parcel could have 1 house and would be preserved in perpetuity, or what's the standard there?
There are sections of the county's PUD, and I do want to pause. There is a development density bonus that would be permitted, but it would not bring it outside of what's permitted under the underlying. So
okay, very important.
That.
Very important.
So what would happen though is if there was density that was permitted or a change, or there was open space that was created, that would be subject to a covenant and restricting it from future use. So commonly, like a rural cluster development, you'd have an open space tract that might be bound and restricted forever from future growth and development, unless someone came back to the county and said, we'd like to make a change at that point.
How do you respond to the lack of sidebars in the PUD statute?
Sure, and it's very difficult for the county to determine what and or where what might be allowed, but what the county wants to do is provide for the public process to unfold. So the county wants to recognize and understand that there is a hearing examiner that makes a decision in response to the input from both the applicant and the public as well. I want to point out that it's not just that there's no standards that are available, but the standards must meet some criteria for clustering along right of way. They do have the obesity standards, and then there must be road and frontage system requirements as well.
Okay, thank you.
But I think the key point for the county is that they can do this. They're allowed to have this mechanism also as part of its development regulations too. I'd like to touch on process next, which I think is important in understanding what happened. One of the petitioner's core arguments is that there was a change made to the comprehensive plan and development regulations after the close of the public comment period. One of the things that is important to understand as part of that is the time duration that occurred between the close of the public comment period, which was May 16th, 2021, and the actual decision, which was in January of 2023. First, the global pandemic certainly took its toll on the county's ability to process the comprehensive plan update because of the participation at the planning commission level. Second, there were 2 SEPA appeal hearings that occurred during that space and time. So the mere passage of time in and of itself is not dispositive of the fact that there was a sweeping change that occurred between the closing of the public comment period and the actual adoption of a recommendation by the planning commission. Second, the statute that governs changes to comprehensive plans says that the changes have to occur at the legislative level. So the statute says that if there's a change made by the legislative body, then it has to go back through a public comment period. In this case, the changes were made at the planning commission level, which is not the legislative body. They're the recommending body to the board
Was
of
there
commissioners.
opportunity for public comment before final approval by the commissioners?
There was not. So the record was closed at the planning commission.
But how could the public comment on the changes?
They couldn't, because the county was not required to provide them with an additional comment period.
They could comment when it got to the Board of County Commissioners.
Sure, but there was no public comment. There was no,
Well, that was my question. Was there an opportunity for public comment at the commissioner level?
there was no independent written process. No, the county commissioners did not send the comprehensive plan out for review and consideration before they took their action.
Right, that wasn't my question, not whether there's this whole process for public outreach and communication.
Sure.
I mean, when this came in front of the county commissioners for approval, that is typically city councils, county commissioners, that's when the public has an opportunity. If they weren't involved earlier,
Sure.
they come and address their elected officials.
So
Was that
there
opportunity?
was no public hearing before the Board of County Commissioners on the recommendation.
Okay.
So do you have a public participation, plan?
Yes.
That was adopted,
The
is
county
that consistent with your public participation plan?
Yes,
Has that public participation plan ever been challenged?
no, it has not.
Well, yeah, let me finish on this line here, though.
Yeah.
I mean, public participation plan doesn't seem to be the question. The question seems to be an alteration of provisions after the public comment period was closed. Was there, what, if any, opportunity was there for the public to comment on these changes?
Sure. Well, the public, the planning commission is the Board of County Commissioners fact-finding body
Right.
and recommending body. They conducted the diligence and deliberation on the comprehensive plan and engaged in the review of the comments and made the updates. The Board of County Commissioners is the adoption body. They're not required to hold a public hearing on the comprehensive plan. The statute doesn't require that. So the legislative body relies upon the work that was done by the planning commission. The issue, and I think the suggestion the petitioner's making is that, and I understand, is that that the planning commission is then, and the community development department are then required to resend out an updated comprehensive plan for public comment and review.
And that's not my question or concern either. My question is, the public fully participates in the process, held at staff level, held at the planning commission level, goes to the neighborhood association meetings, et cetera. Understanding that maybe their comments will be incorporated into the document or not. But at some point, planning commission makes those get incorporated into it. And that, like, whether their comments get incorporated into it or not, the public has to live with that.
Right.
And that's what the planning commission reviews and sends up. And my concern is, if they fully participated in the process, but then subsequent to the public comment period, additional changes were made, do they not have an opportunity when this is in front of the county commissioners, call it a public hearing or not, to address the county commissioners and saying, we were fine with this earlier version that was adopted, we're not fine with this subsequent change?
Sure, the commissioners adopted the comprehensive plan and their resolution in an open public meeting.
Right.
They do have an ordinary public comment period.
Well, I guess that's what I was
Yeah,
trying
they
to.
did not have a specific public comment on this resolution.
But the opportunity was there.
The opportunity was there.
And isn't that part of the whole public comment process?
Yeah, and apologies for trying to correct and maybe.
No, I understand. You want to make sure you're definite in terms of the terms of what you're defining as the county's public participation process.
Right, so the county said there's only limited circumstances where the county commissioners would have had to reopen a public process and conduct as you and I might call, a public hearing before the public. And these were not them. This was not any one of the four, this was not any requirements. There were no changes that they made at their body. But yes, it was an open public meeting and did comply with those requirements.
So, okay, I want to make sure we understand it, because this is a very good point. So there was a comment period. Did any of the opponents comment?
That's right.
Did anybody comment?
Yeah, the county's matrix is 73 comments long.
Yeah, at that hearing. No, it wasn't a hearing. At the commissioners' meeting where they passed this, was there a comment there?
I could not, the petitioners in fact actually might have been present, but I could not tell you whether the commissioners fielded comments prior to their adoption of the resolution.
When was the public comment period in relation to the passage of the outline?
Well, it was concluded in May of 2021.
No, I got that. See, this is very detailed. I'm trying to get at your assertion is there's no need to have a public hearing. Okay. And we're trying to get at, did the public have an opportunity to get up and say something at the meeting, if it was a legislative meeting, not a hearing, did the public have opportunity to speak to anything that was on the agenda that day? Because normally that's what happens. You have a public comment period. Normally, public comment periods are early in the process.
Sure.
Of a general meeting of the planning commission.
Sure.
Do you have the agenda? Is the agenda for that meeting in the record?
The agenda for the meeting is not in the record.
Interesting. Okay. Well, tell me what happened.
Well, as best I can recall, and I was not present at that meeting, was that the county had a comment period generally for all those items that were on the agenda. And that then, as part of its ordinary business activities, adopted the resolution.
Okay.
I think the one notice that we include as part of the record, I believe, was the record of the planning commission's public hearing. Not the board. The board county commission did not hand up.
And the board gave due notice to their meeting in which they passed it, where they said this would be before the, correct?
Correct. As required for any of its ordinary public meetings.
It was on the agenda.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have that announcement in the record?
We do not. But we can certainly provide it as supplements.
Do you have any objection for providing that as a supplement?
We have no objection to providing the agenda for the Board of County Commissioners meeting where the resolution was adopted.
Thank you. Can you provide that?
We will provide.
Thank you.
Agenda
Okay.
to that effect.
Okay, we've stopped on that enough for now. Let's keep going.
I understand. The other issue we'd like to address is the creation.
Oh, sorry, we're just talking.
Oh, pardon.
Keep going.
Is that the county did create an internally consistent plan. So the first issue is there's no specific language that the petitioners have been able to point to, which says that in one section you're able to do X, Y, and Z, and then in another section says you cannot do those very same things. There's no mutually exclusive language within the county's code or development regulations that exist. So the specific language is not present. The county has very thoughtfully and carefully weaved together goals and policies in order to make sure that the rural environment, its environmentally sensitive, and its other regulations all fold together into a cohesive package. That is so that they're not broken apart. And those plans, such as providing for protections of critical areas, are addressed. Providing for protection of natural surface waters, providing for rural densities, and limiting extensions of utilities and land limited. So there's very thoughtful marrying of analysis amongst the county's goals and policies in order to make sure that those two align. It doesn't say that the county can extend utilities in one instance when it can't in another section. That doesn't exist within the county's comprehensive plan. The petitioners haven't been able to show that level of inconsistency as well. The other piece that we want to point as well is this idea of kind of development of commercial and industrial zones specifically. So the Growth Management Act does not require the county to adopt commercial or industrial zoning designations. The GMA is, first, there's nothing within the GMA that says that they have to designate them in their comprehensive plan. Second, there's nothing that says that there needs to be a very specific and identifiable zoning designation that marries up. The county instead says, we're going to regulate those through our individual development standards. So whether it be the critical areas ordinances, the wetlands, the wetland buffers, shorelines, or any other hazardous areas, those are what is going to constrain commercial or industrial development within the county. It's not going to be a specific set of development regulations that align with that. There's no freestanding chapters.
Well, I was gonna ask you about that. I mean, looking at your brief, page 16, you quote these, rural land use policies 4, 6, and 9, where, for example, looking at number 6, Oreille County Development Code will specify performance standards. And I understand you're not gonna put the performance standards within a land use policy, but are they somewhere else in the code and they haven't been adopted?
There's no commercial or industrial standard. There's no like lot size requirement or parking requirements or things like that.
Right.
Right.
Well, I mean, it says that standards that will eliminate or mitigate the potentially adverse effects of industrial or commercial uses on neighboring lands. Sure. Whether you create, and apparently you haven't, and that's fine, a code, I mean, a zone that's called, industrial or commercial.
Right.
Is the question. The question is, are there adopted performance standards to mitigate the adverse effects of industrial and commercial uses?
Right. The county does that through its critical areas ordinances, wetlands, and
And those have been adopted.
And those have been adopted, and those are within the development regulations. That's correct.
All right, that's my own question.
The county also, and I think there's some confusion as part of our argument, not to move on to the sensitive areas, because I think there's some confusion about what the county did and what the county was required to rely upon as it related to best available science. So the county used best available science in terms of its designation of the critical areas of the sensitive areas code. So the county used an anchor QEA report prepared for Stevens County, which is the neighboring jurisdiction, like over the hill from here, which carries with it very similar geography, topography, and conditions that are on the ground as Monterey County. There's no need for the county to engage in duplicative analysis in conjunction with its review and consideration of the best available science. It used what Stevens County had already done because criteria were the same. And so it did not deviate from best available science. And so that being said, it still showed its work in terms of the methodology that it used for the purposes of determining buffers and wetlands in Monterey County.
Is there some sort of area of conflict between the best available science that FutureWise identified and the best available science that Oreille relied upon? I don't know if there's a substantive dispute, but the county's reliance upon best available science allowed for a reduced buffer under the inter-QEA reports that were different from what the department. And that would be the point of departure between Stevens County, FutureWise's best available science and Stevens County.
That's right.
Yours.
Yeah, and notwithstanding that, though, the Department of Fish and Wildlife didn't comment on it. And I think we mentioned in our briefing on an issue related to SEPA, but I think the same concept holds true here, which is if the responsible agencies don't comment, then how is the county supposed to know that it's doing the wrong thing? As this board is also well aware, FutureWise is more than capable of filing appeals of land use actions and petitions for review with this body, and chose not to do so based upon this decision too. So I think that speaks to the work that the county did in response to that comment and incorporated it, and then it showed again in its comment matrix where it applied that best available science to determine the buffers, both for wetlands and the stream typing. So it's in the work that was put together and assembled by the county. The other issue is the county wanted to discuss is the table of permitted uses as perhaps maybe one of the core issues that the petitioners seem to focus on is the form of the action in which the county followed to get its regulations adopted. So the language of the Planning Commission's recommendation on January 17th was really to take 5 separate actions. One was to recommend the adoption of the comprehensive plan. The second was to amend the Monterey County table of permitted uses to include those zoning designations. They amended the development regulations. They also amended the zoning and future land use maps and the amended natural resource land designations based upon their review. To point out though, the table of permitted uses in the comment matrix says that there are going to be changes that are made post recommendation. Admittedly, there's no table that has been generated, but the county indicated that it would update the table of permitted uses to reflect those comments that were provided by FutureWise. And then the Board of County Commissioners followed that up with its action on February 6th to adopt the recommendation of the Planning Commission. So the dots between the comments, the response, and the formal adoption by the county commissioners are linked between what ultimately would be created as a Word document or a document posted to the county's website.
Does it exist today?
No, because now we're on appeal before the Growth Management Hearings Board. So there's no specific document that says that.
I mean, counties continue to take actions despite their appeals. I mean,
Correct.
if you stay in place.
The county has not adopted a new table of permitted use as of yet. Although it did. I mean, it has not created the Word document, excuse me. It took the action to adopt the table of permitted use. It just has not created the Word document.
It hasn't been published yet.
It has not been published yet, that's right. The other issue and kind of the core twin beyond the Growth Management Act issue is really the SEPA issue. I think the board highlights correctly. The issue is the decision by the county's hearing examiner that's under review and whether that decision was improper. As the county mentioned, it's really been a two-step process that the county has followed in terms of reviewing SEPA. The first was reversed. Admittedly, the county's hearing examiner said, go back and revise your SEPA analysis to align with our expectations of what SEPA review should look like in circumstances. And the county did that in response and prepared a revised and more robust SEPA checklist. I believe that's the index of record item number 6. And so the county's burden really is to show that it engaged in prima facie compliance with SEPA. It didn't pay lip service to the environmental review process, and it didn't because of the second SEPA checklist that was prepared. It's not a consequence that Mr. Snow is both the preparer of the SEPA checklist and also the responsible official. There's nothing under SEPA that prohibits him from acting in the dual role. And in fact, there has been a check and balance in this case because the hearing examiner has stepped in and made a review of the SEPA checklist and the environmental determination the second time. The second environmental review conducted by the county was affirmed on all grounds by the county's hearing examiner, who really looked at much of the same evidence that was recited in the brief that was filed by the petitioners and said it's not credible because it doesn't show a linkage between the actual development that could occur within the county and what the consequences of that action would be. So it's one thing to say that there can be impacts to cats and dogs as a result of the environmental review, but there's an entirely different conversation when it says, well, what's really going to happen if the county makes this comprehensive plan update as part of the process? And the hearing examiner said both on wildlife impacts and then also wetland issues that the evidence that there was no evidence to support the assertions because there lacked the linkage between the two. The other thing is that the county's really not, sorry.
Did you do everything under number 11 on checklist that you said you were going to do?
Let me look at number 11.
Yeah, let's bring this up.
Double check.
I know there's a number of issues.
Yes.
And the reason I ask is because of the fact that you failed your first one. Was there anything specifically, was this added after your first SEPA checklist or was this included in the first checklist?
No, this is added in the second checklist.
Okay.
So that everything that's occurred in this chapter has been undertaken.
Okay.
So this was part of the county's SEPA review.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a couple concepts I think that are really important to think about with the county's SEPA review. One is just the scope, right? Professor Settle in this green book that governs, or his review of SEPA says that it has to be reasonable under the circumstances. The responsible official isn't required to go beyond the rule of reason and what is reasonable under the circumstances in order for him to engage and or consider what the environmental consequences are. The county did that. And the county considered as best it could what it believed future growth to be within the county. 45 new residents of the county per year is not in and of itself a significant amount of growth. I think that's a good word. But the 45, but the county also can't go beyond and assume that there are thousands of people moving to Ponderay County merely beyond what it could. It just can't. That's beyond what's rational under the circumstances.
Well, we already have that established that you have 45
people
per year. So
and 20.
Let me stop you again.
Okay.
And this was brought up by the petitioner, and so under number 12, the checklist. So, second paragraph, Ponderay County comprehensive plan update sensitivity area code and development regulations. Pardon me. And development regulations update applies to the entire areas of Ponderay County. The updated SAC will apply to all critical areas within Ponderay County, including wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat, conservation areas, frequently flooded areas, critical aquifer recharge areas, and biological habitats. The updated development regulations will apply to all related development activities within the county. What updated development regulations were adopted?
They were attached to the county's resolution that was a part of the what was adopted by the commissioners.
Yeah, give me the date stamp, would you?
No, I'll give you the yes, of course. That is starting at. Forgive me.
No, it's okay. I popped this on you, so
No, it's great.
We need this kind of thing to deal with
Sure. So the county's updated development regulations start at POC 000127.
Thank you.
And flow for the next 100 odd pages.
Okay, keep going.
So the county went through its environmental review process as it was reasonable under the circumstances. First, I think it's important to understand that the county does retain authority to review subsequent projects. So there's nothing that says because the county updates its comprehensive plan that effectively the cart's out of the barn. And in this case, the county has that power to review subsequent projects or environmental consideration. So the thing, give me just a second here. It's allowed under the ULOC versus Bremerton case, and also following the Spokane County versus Eastern Washington Growth Management Hearing Board case as well, which is the subsequent review and approval of projects. If it's retained by the county, it's perfectly acceptable to defer is not the right word, but consider those impacts down the line when the responsible official is in a better position to make that review. And the hearing examiner correctly recognized that, is the county has full authority to condition and review projects as appropriate when it knows what they are. One of the things that is important is that during the time period when the petitioners filed their first SEPA appeal and the county's decisions of the responsible official was reversed, the county received a second or a conditional use permit application that's described in its condition in the SEPA checklist, and that SEPA checklist reflected those changing projects. So to the extent that the county knew what the consequences of its development were going to be or would be allowed, it put them into the SEPA checklist.
So can I my ignorance a little bit, and I guess, why would this not be a MDNS versus a DDNS?
There's no mitigation that was imposed.
Okay, so the actual word mitigation that you have in here, some of the explanations that these will mitigate any impacts.
Right,
It's not strong enough to make it a MDNS.
correct. It's not an MDNS because if the mitigated determination non-significance really takes it and pulls it into the realm of an EIS. What the county's saying is, we have
Oh, it doesn't? It doesn't require any EIS if you do an MDNS.
correct, it does not, but if it was unmitigated, it might require an EIS.
Of course.
Yeah, but
And
apologies.
what you're saying is that the quote unquote mitigations that aren't really mitigations here are not dealing with issues that would require an EIS.
Correct, that's right. The county's saying is, these are the ways in which the consequences of development are going to be addressed.
I understand. Thank
And through our various codes.
you.
So in each case, such as the Spokane County case versus the Growth Board, that case is a little bit different. The county, in that case, was going to adopt a comprehensive plan amendment that was going to permit a use to occur. The county already knew what the use was going to be when the comprehensive plan amendment and designation was undertaken. In this case, the county doesn't know what's going to happen and what the consequences of development are going to be.
And I think in that case, there were specific comments from the agencies
Correct.
with concerns about environment that were not.
That's correct. I was a participant in council of record for one of the parties in that case. And it was a very specific project that was folded into a non-project action. This is not the case where there is a specific contemplated project. We also wanted to highlight that EISs are not universally required for comprehensive plan upgrades. This board and the courts have both recognized that DNSs are acceptable and are appropriate for environmental review. But the King County versus the State Boundary Review Board is a case where there was a very specific project identified. And in that case, that's when it was reviewed. This is not the same case. This is the county's routine updates to its comprehensive plan, development regulations, and underlying codes. Here. And then we also wanted to highlight some specific issues that the petition also kind of raised. One was about fish and wildlife, and then the other one was about climate change. Both were discarded by the hearing examiner. As we pointed out that the hearing examiner said there's no relationship to the impacts you identify and the consequences of which proposal. And the hearing examiner said, as to Mr. William Meyer's testimony, that there was no correlation, and then he identified other testimonies being similarly deficient. So the same issues are being kind of relitigated here before the board, notwithstanding the hearing examiner's kind of discarding of those same positions. And also the Department of Fish and Wildlife did not comment on the 2022 secret checklist. And that is recognized under the Washington Administrative Code as being, if an agency doesn't respond, it's deemed to not have any objection to the review that's done. So I think that the absence of commentary by the Department of Fish and Wildlife speaks volumes. And finally, there's been an overriding kind of discussion about climate change in the county's SEPA checklist. First, RG Newick agreed that the county considered climate change in its SEPA checklist at the hearing. And second, it actually appears into multiple sections of the county SEPA checklist, namely air and consideration for animals as well. And those are on the base numbers 301 and 306. So the county believes that it's complied with its obligations under SEPA because it's undertaken what's reasonable under the circumstances in both cases. So with that, I will conclude my comments with respect to the update. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Further questions?
No, thanks.
No questions for me at this point.
Thank you.
We may have questions for both of you in a minute. But it's kind of our last time to use both of it to your questions. So we have 10 minutes for the petitioner to respond.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request another short break. Of course. Well, I'd like to consult with my clients about what we just heard. And,
Of course. All right, yeah, let's take 10 minutes. Be back here.
Recording stopped.
12:23.